In the stillness of a summer night, the gruesome murders of Sharon Tate and her friends left behind more than just bloodshed. They left a chilling message scrawled on the wall in crimson. Pig. This haunting act was just the beginning of Charles Manson's terrifying manipulation of young, impressionable followers, driven by a delusional vision of societal collapse. In this video, we unravel the dark story behind the murders, the twisted mind of Manson, and the chilling aftermath that shook America to its core. Charles Manson's story begins not with the man himself, but with the world he was born into, a world marked by despair, broken promises, and fractured families. Born in 1934 during the Great Depression, Manson entered a society struggling to survive, where prosperity had long been replaced by the harsh realities of poverty. His mother, Kathleen Maddox, was a 16-year-old runaway, wild and reckless, with little capacity for motherhood. One infamous story tells of her offering Charles to a childless waitress in exchange for a pitcher of beer, a tale that foreshadowed the neglect that would define his early years. Without a father to guide him, Manson's biological father, Colonel Walker Henderson Scott, had disappeared before his birth, leaving only his name behind. The man who briefly became his stepfather, William Manson, gave him his surname but vanished soon after. Abandonment became a recurring theme in Charles's life. His childhood was a chaotic blend of poverty and neglect. His mother, often incarcerated, left him in the care of relatives who treated him as a burden. When Kathleen went to prison for robbing a gas station, young Charles was sent to live with his strict aunt and uncle in rural West Virginia, where his rebellion against authority began. One memorable incident from this time would shape his life. Charles, eager to impress his cousins, wore a dress to school after a dare from his uncle. Humiliated by the taunts of his peers, this episode deepened his disdain for societal norms. As a teenager, he began to lash out, committing petty thefts that escalated into burglaries, eventually landing him in juvenile detention. These institutions were not rehabilitative. They were harsh, violent places where Manson learned survival through manipulation and charm. His ability to read people and influence others began to develop, a skill that would later become his most dangerous weapon. In these facilities, Manson also encountered brutal punishment and isolation, which hardened him and reinforced his belief that the world was cruel and unforgiving. Despite his criminal record, Manson yearned for a sense of belonging, a family that would never abandon him as his own had. But his concept of family was warped. It wasn't about love or loyalty, it was about control. During his prison years, Manson discovered Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. He absorbed its lessons on persuasion and manipulation, using them to charm fellow inmates and gain power. At the same time, Manson explored music, particularly the guitar, which became his escape and a tool he would later use to attract followers. He wrote songs about loneliness and yearning, projecting an image of a tortured artist. By the time Manson was released from prison in the mid-1960s, he had spent over half his life behind bars. The world outside had changed. When Charles Manson arrived in San Francisco in 1967, the summer of love was nearing its crescendo. The streets of Haight-Ashbury pulsed with the rhythm of revolution. Psychedelic posters advertised free concerts in Golden Gate Park. The air was thick with incense and patchouli, masking the unwashed scent of a generation rebelling against conformity. Students and drifters, poets and dreamers, all gathered under a banner of love and liberation. It was the perfect breeding ground for a man like Manson. To the untrained eye, he looked like just another wanderer, scruffy beard, threadbare clothes, and a beat-up guitar slung over his shoulder. But Charles wasn't just passing through. He saw the hate, as fertile ground for his ambitions. Here were the lost and broken souls he had spent years preparing to manipulate, idealistic, impressionable, and searching for a sense of belonging. The hippie movement's ethos of free love and spiritual awakening gave Manson the perfect cover for his true intentions. Manson began frequenting crash pads and communes, using his charisma to weave his way into the lives of those he met. His prison-honed skills of persuasion found new potency among the young women drawn to his magnetic presence. He spoke in riddles, blending scraps of Eastern philosophy with biblical references, creating an aura of mysticism. "You don't need parents," he would tell them. "I am your father, your mother, your everything." It wasn't long before he started collecting followers, young women who hung on his every word, believing they had found a guru in a world that seemed increasingly directionless. One of the first to fall under his spell was Mary Bruner, a shy and bookish Midwestern transplant working as a library assistant at UC Berkeley. Bruner was everything Manson wasn't: quiet, reserved, and yearning for adventure. Manson moved into her apartment within weeks of their meeting, transforming her tidy life into a chaotic experiment in communal living. Through Brunner, Manson began to attract others, building the foundations of what he would later call his family. But Manson's appeal wasn't just his words. He had a way of making people feel seen in a way they never had before. He'd listen intently, probing their insecurities and fears, then reflecting back to them the image of the person they wanted to be. For women who felt ignored or dismissed by a patriarchal society, Manson's attention was intoxicating. He didn't just seduce them, he reprogrammed them, planting seeds of dependency and devotion. In the backdrop of his growing entourage, Manson's obsession with music intensified. The hate was alive with the sounds of Jefferson Airplane, Janis Joplin, and the Grateful Dead, and Manson dreamed of joining their ranks. He fancied himself a visionary, a prophet whose music would inspire a revolution. He spent hours strumming his guitar in Golden Gate Park, crafting songs that mixed folk melodies with dark, cryptic lyrics. His music wasn't particularly good, but that hardly mattered to his followers. To them, his voice carried the weight of truth. What isn't often discussed is how Manson cultivated his control, not just through charisma, but through calculated acts of psychological domination. He would pit his followers against each other, creating an atmosphere of competition and dependency. One evening, he reportedly made the women in his group strip naked and circle him, pointing out their physical flaws as he berated them for their ego attachments. The cruelty wasn't random. It was a deliberate effort to break their sense of self-worth, making them more malleable to his will. Drugs played a key role in this transformation. LSD, already a staple of the counterculture, became one of Manson's most potent tools. "You're seeing God," he'd say as colors swirled and reality dissolved. "And God is me." By 1968, the family had grown into a roving band of drifters, traveling in an old, beat-up school bus painted with psychedelic designs. They wandered from San Francisco to Los Angeles, stopping at communes and ranches, spreading Manson's gospel along the way. Among those who joined during this period were Susan Atkins, a former topless dancer who saw Manson as her savior, and Patricia Krenwinkel, a troubled young woman who fled a life of rejection to find solace in Manson's words. These women, along with others, would later become key players in the horrifying acts that cemented Manson's legacy. But even as Manson's following grew, so did his paranoia. He began speaking of a coming apocalypse, warning his followers that the world outside was crumbling and that only they would survive. He turned their communal living arrangements into rehearsals for his vision of an isolated, self-sustaining utopia. The family's arrival in Los Angeles coincided with the city's transformation into a hub for the burgeoning rock scene. Sunset strip clubs like the Whiskey A Go-Go and the Troubadour buzzed with the energy of bands like the Doors, the Byrds, and the Beach Boys. Manson, ever the opportunist, saw this scene as a stage waiting for him to conquer. He began hanging around these venues, mingling with aspiring musicians and industry insiders, spinning tales of his prison-hardened wisdom and spiritual insight. It was through one of these connections that Manson crossed paths with Dennis Wilson, the drummer of the Beach Boys. The meeting was as much an accident as it was a turning point. Wilson picked up two hitchhikers. After a day spent in conversation, the women invited Wilson to meet their guru. What followed was a surreal chapter in Manson's rise, one that has often been glossed over in the retellings. Manson and the family soon moved into Wilson's sprawling Pacific Palisades home. For weeks, the family lived rent-free in luxury, draining Wilson's resources while indulging in wild, drug-fueled parties. Manson, always the performer, used these gatherings as an opportunity to showcase his music. He played his songs for anyone who would listen, insisting that his lyrics held the key to a new world order. Wilson, initially intrigued, began to sour on Manson's erratic behavior and increasingly bizarre prophecies. By the time the family finally left, they had reportedly cost Wilson over $100,000 in damages and expenses, a sum that included a significant medical bill for treating gonorrhea contracted by several of the family members. But Manson's connection to Wilson wasn't entirely fruitless. Through him, Manson met producer Terry Melcher, a pivotal figure in the Los Angeles music scene. Melcher, the son of actress Doris Day, was a well-connected producer who had worked with acts like the Byrds and Paul Revere, the Raiders. Manson fixated on Melcher as his ticket to stardom. He performed his songs for Melcher and even arranged for the family to give a bizarre, cult-like performance at the producer's home. But Melcher, like Wilson, ultimately dismissed Manson as more trouble than he was worth. This rejection marked a turning point in Manson's psyche. He began to see the music industry, and by extension Hollywood, as emblematic of the establishment he despised. His dreams of fame and fortune turned sour, replaced by a simmering resentment. He started speaking to the family about taking matters into their own hands, hinting at a violent reckoning. "If they won't give us what we want," he reportedly told them, "we'll take it." His rhetoric grew more apocalyptic, peppered with references to helter-skelter, the race war he believed was imminent. His followers, already conditioned to see him as a prophet, embraced these ideas with terrifying devotion. As the family settled into the Spahn Ranch, a dilapidated former movie set in the Santa Susana Mountains, Manson's control tightened. He forbade his followers from speaking without his permission and instituted a series of bizarre rituals designed to strip them of their individuality. One former family member later recalled how Manson would assign each follower a new name, a symbolic erasure of their past identities. "Charlie told us that our old lives were dead," she said. "We were reborn as part of him." The family's time at Spahn Ranch also saw the arrival of key figures who would play central roles in the crimes to come. Tex Watson, a clean-cut former athlete from Texas, joined the group during this period, drawn by Manson's charisma and the promise of spiritual enlightenment. Watson would later become one of Manson's most loyal enforcers, carrying out acts of unspeakable violence in his name. Another important but lesser discussed figure was Bobby Beausoleil, a musician and drifter who shared Manson's obsession with music. Beausoleil's presence added a layer of complexity to the family's dynamics. While he initially saw himself as a peer to Manson, their relationship quickly devolved into one of rivalry and manipulation. Manson was no longer content to preach his apocalyptic vision. He was ready to act on it. In the summer of 1969, the counterculture's peaceful idealism began to unravel, giving way to something darker. Manson's orders were chillingly specific. On the night of August 8, 1969, he sent several members of the Manson family to carry out the murder of someone he deemed to be part of the establishment. He chose to target Sharon Tate, an actress and the wife of director Roman Polanski, along with those staying in her home. Polanski, however, was out of the country at the time. At around midnight, Manson's followers, Charles Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian, arrived at the secluded home at 10,050 Cielo Drive in the Hollywood Hills. They approached the house under the cover of darkness, their instructions clear. Watson, the group's enforcer, was the first to approach the home, scaling the gate with ease. Once inside, the murderers acted with a chilling coldness, terrorizing the occupants of the house. Sharon Tate, who was 8 months pregnant, was in the living room at the time, talking with friends. Jay Sebring, a celebrity hairstylist, was visiting, along with Abigail Folger, the heiress to the Folger coffee fortune, and her boyfriend, Wojciech Frykowski, a Polish screenwriter. As Watson burst through the door, the family members quickly subdued the victims, forcing them into the house. Once inside, the murders began. Watson immediately attacked Frykowski, stabbing him multiple times as he tried to escape. Folger was also stabbed to death in the driveway as she attempted to flee. Tate, the most famous of the victims, was tragically the last to die. The murderers, led by Watson, violently ended her life, stabbing her a total of 16 times, some of the wounds brutal and deep. The killers then proceeded to tie the bodies up, adding to the gruesome nature of the crime. The most chilling aspect of the crime was the message the killers left behind. Using Sharon Tate's blood, they scrawled the word "pig" on the front door of the house. Manson had instructed his followers to commit these murders in a way that would fuel the racial tensions he believed would spark the race war. The word "pig" was a direct message to the establishment, an act of rebellion meant to provoke fear and chaos in society. Just 2 nights later, Manson sent his followers out again, this time targeting the LaBianca family. The victims were Leno and Rosemary LaBianca, a wealthy couple who lived in the Los Angeles area. This time, the family arrived at the LaBianca residence in the middle of the night. They broke into the home and, in an almost ritualistic manner, tortured and killed the LaBiancas. Leno, the husband, was stabbed repeatedly, and his wife, Rosemary, was also brutally murdered. The killers then used the blood of the victims to scrawl more messages on the walls, including "Death to pigs" and "Rise." The messages were not only meant to further the mythos of Helter Skelter, but were intended to create fear and confusion. The murders of Sharon Tate and the LaBiancas were not just acts of violence. They were the manifestation of Manson's madness, a madness that twisted the very foundations of the counterculture. The murders themselves were not simply the work of deranged individuals. They were the product of Manson's years of manipulation, brainwashing, and exploitation. The world was stunned by the shocking brutality of the Tate LaBianca murders, and in the days that followed, Los Angeles became a city paralyzed by fear. The killings were so savage, so senseless, that authorities struggled to find any coherent motive. The grisly crime scenes, marked with bloody handprints and cryptic messages scrawled on the walls, sent a shiver through the public. It was as if a dark, sinister force had descended upon the city. For a time, the investigation seemed hopelessly stalled. There were no clear suspects, no solid leads. But everything changed when Bobby Beausoleil, a member of Manson's family, was arrested for the murder of Gary Hinman, a fellow cult member. While in custody, Beausoleil made a fatal mistake, bragging about his involvement with Manson. This clue sent investigators into overdrive, and soon, the police started connecting the dots between Beausoleil, Manson, and the shocking murders. But the breakthrough came not through the obvious ties, but through the obsessive clues left behind in blood. When police began digging into Manson's life and his followers, they uncovered a disturbing pattern. By late 1969, Manson and several of his followers, including Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, Leslie Van Houten, and Tex Watson, were arrested. The arrest of Manson sent shockwaves through the nation. The trial of Manson and his followers captivated the world, with Manson himself at the center of the storm. As the proceedings unfolded, it became clear that Manson relished the attention. He adopted bizarre antics, including carving an X into his forehead, which he later modified into a swastika, to signify his rejection of society and his own distorted sense of revolution. Manson's followers, including Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten, followed his lead, displaying the same fervor and blind loyalty. They spoke of him in almost worshipful terms, seeing him as a messianic figure. The trial transformed Manson from a mere criminal into a media sensation. In 1971, after months of intense media coverage and public scrutiny, Manson and his followers were convicted of multiple murders. Manson was sentenced to death, but California's Supreme Court ruled to abolish the death penalty, commuting his sentence to life in prison. It was a hollow victory, as the scars left by Manson's crimes would linger far beyond the courtroom. Manson's manipulative hold over his followers was a disturbing reminder of the dangers of unchecked influence. In 2017, Manson died at the age of 83 from natural causes after spending over 4 decades in prison. His death was a stark end to the reign of one of history's most infamous cult leaders. But the impact of his crimes and the cultural ripple effects would continue to be felt for years to come. Charles Manson's reign of terror continues to haunt the world, a terrifying reminder of the power of manipulation and delusion. If you found this story unsettling, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more dark tales from history. Drop a comment below with what story you want us to dive into next.